Hashem, today's daf yomi is Horayos daf vav, Horayos 6. The daf is dedicated for Shmir for Chayalim. That's all for the Shvuyim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. We're going to start in the bottom of Hayam Abayis, 3 lines from the bottom. We're going to review first the three opinions about if there's a communal mistake based upon a mistaken ruling of the court called the Parel and Davar Shel Tzibur is supposed to be brought. Question is, who brings it? Our mayor says the Bezdin brings it, and we're going to challenge that position. Rabbi Yehuda says each of the tribes brings it, but not the Bezdin. And Rabbi Shimon says the Bezdin and the tribes and the Bezdin. So Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, we have a Bryce, and the Bryce says, Rabbi Shimon says, Ma tamalo parashini ben bakar tikach chatas. Why does it have to say in the pasuk you should take a second bull for a sin offering? We already know it's a second bull. If it's to teach us that there are two bulls there, one for an olah, one for a chatas, well, kvar nemar v'asas chatas esechad olah Hashem. So why does it have to say? And then the second bull you should take for a sin offering. And I might think that this sin offering should be eaten by the Levium. Now, that's in itself its own question because Levium never eat the sin offering. So you could either say maybe a really different text, it should be Kohanim here. But anyway, because then there's another, the rest of the pasuk says, and the second bowl is for an olah. And so therefore we see from here, ma olah lo nachal. It's just like the olah is not eaten. So too, chatos lo nachalas. Also the sin offering is not eaten. Kayotzibo, similarly, we're on top of Vav Al. I'm Rabbi Yossi. Habam may Hashvi Agola, that in the time of Ezra, it says in the pasuk, those who came from the captivity, Bnei Agola, the children of the exile, Hikrivu Olos Leilukei Yisrael. They brought Olos to the God of Israel. Parim Shnei Masar. They brought 12 bulls. So the Gemara asks the question, Hakol Ola, would they really be all of these offerings? And it says in the pasuk, Hakol Ola, and the pasuk is difficult. Hakol Ola Sel Kadaitach. You think that all the offerings being brought were Ola? It's difficult. Avshar Shechatos Ola. Is it possible that the sin offerings, because it says in the pasuk, "Kikrivu olos al Israel, parim shnei masar al kol Israel ilim tishem v'shisha kvasim shivim v'shivat sifirei," which is goats, are chatas shnei masar hakol olah. So everything is an olah. But how can you say that these sin offerings are called an olah? Efshar shechatas olah. Why are they calling the sin offering an olah? Ella, so rather what it means is, and thank you, Bill, what it means is hakol ka'olah, that all these sin offerings are like an olah. Ma'olah lo nechal. It's just like this olah, like the olah is not in. Avchatas lo nechal. So these sin offerings that those who returned from exile in Babylon, in Persia, and not Persia, in Iraq, did not bring this, did not eat from it. They brought these bull and these goat offerings for idolatry. We already saw if there was a mistaken ruling of the court, they bring the bull and the goat, and that's what it was, and they didn't eat it. Should also be made tzidkiyahu. It refers to the idolatry that they did in the time of tzidkiyahu. The end of the first temple's reign was tzidkiyahu, and they worshipped idolatry then. And the Bnei Goa, those who returned from exile from Bavel, they brought this olah and this chatos for that sin offering. So the Gemara says, well, but wait, let's go break it up, because what did we just say? We just said they brought 12 sin offerings because of the sin of the mistaken ruling of the court. Bishlam and Rabbi Yehuda, we understand that Rabbi Yehuda could say this text makes sense. This pasuk makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda. Mishkachas lavahani shnei masar chatos could go into chatos shnei masar shvatim. The Ma'aser Shnei Masar Seira Minami the Chatus Shiva Shvatim Ushara inach begrira. It makes sense why Rabbi Yehuda says there's 12 sin offerings brought, because that's his position, that each tribe has to bring one, either because they all sin or because through what's called gerira, that they're dragged into the sin by the other tribes. But we have a problem, because, and also it can make sense according to Rabbi Shimon. Well, Rabbi Shimon we could also have Rabbi Shimon could go into Chatu Achadasar Shvatim, that 11 tribes sinned, with the Maisu Achadasar Seirim, that they bring 11 goats for Idach, and the 12th one is the Bezin. That's from the court. Or Mayor, the Amar Bezin Mevian Vutzibor. According to Rabbi Mayor, who he says there's only one offering brought, and that's by the Bezdin, and the community brings it in, not the court brings it in, not each tribe. So if that's the case, how do you have 12 sin offerings according to Rabbi Meir? So therefore this verse is contradicting Rabbi Meir. So Gemara explains, no, what's the issue? No, it's so that Rabbi Meir would say the Jewish people sin 12 times in a row, and that's how they got to the 12 tribes. So the Gemara says, now that we've established that it's not a question on Rabbi Meir, the Gemara says, but wait, this price itself is difficult. How could these people who return from captivity have brought these offerings for the people who sinned in the time of Tzidkiyahu? But why would that be the case? They all died. Those people who sinned in the time of Tzidkiyahu, they had died, because what Tzidkiyahu was at the end of the destruction of the first temple, and this was 70 years later when they started to rebuild it. But they're now dead. So the people from Tzidkiyahu. So how can you bring a sin offering for somebody who's dead? Amar Papa. So Rav Papa says yes, and we'll learn about this more in Amma Beis. Kik Miri, that we have a teaching that if you have a sin offering, an animal, a goat that was separated to be a sin offering, and its owner died, that animal is not sacrificed, but it's put into a room. It's one of the 5 chatos that shemesu, one of the 5 chatos that have to die by being just placed in a room and starving to death. But that is only the case if an individual owner dies. But hani mili b'yachad, that's only by an individual of a lobat tzibor, but not if their community, by a communal sin offering. This law of death, or that if that even though the community dies, we don't, the sin offering of the community does not have to die. So the Gemara says, well, Menale or Pap, and I said upstairs, the Chiddush, not the Chiddush, the Drash, that even though we say this concept, it has a very technical perspective that the sin offering continues, but we can also say there's no concept of death by a community. Death is only by an individual, but if we submit ourselves to the community, then we'll live on forever. So the Gemara says, where does Rav Papa know this idea that there's no death by the community and the sin offering can still be brought? If you want to say it comes from the pasuk, that after your fathers will come your children, which implies that children stand in the place of their fathers, and just like their fathers, and like their fathers are alive, and so therefore they're the children of Tzidkiyahu, so it's like they're alive. If that's the case, even individuals should be able to bring the offering of their ancestor who died. So therefore, Ella Dukya Dera Papa Misayir Dera Chodesh, it comes from the goat of Rosh Chodesh. That's where Papa's inference comes from. The Amar Achmana Maisi Mitruma Salishka, because the Torah tells us that the goat of Rosh Chodesh comes from the Truma Salishka, from the money that was collected by the temple. But the Jewish people, it's presumably the case that since you have the Rosh Chodesh, all the money is collected for Nisa. And then, of course, some of the people will die during the year. And even though they died, and we're still going to bring the offering from them. Those who are remaining, how are they bringing it? Maisu means to bring. Maisi means to die. It's not the same word. You could be confused. No. So we see from here, that even though the owners died from it, the offering is still brought by a sin offering, by a communal offering. The Gemara says, what kind of question is that? Midami, there's a distinction between the two cases. Rosh Chodesh, Dilma Maisu Mitzibor. The goat of Rosh Chodesh, we just say maybe some of them died, and we still allow you to bring it. But here, it's 70 years later. For sure, they died. So the answer for Rav Papa, the explanation for Rav Papa, how does he know that by a communal offering, we don't say this law of achata shemesu ba'ala, the owner died? He brings a proof for it from here, from the case of the eglah rufa, from the decapitated heifer. What's the law of the decapitated heifer? That if you find the dead body, you bring the elders go into the Nachal Eitan, and they bring this animal as an offering. They not as an offering, but they break the neck of the eglah rufa. So this is the idea. It says kaper. When they do that, they go through the ritual and they say kaper la'am Klal Yisrael asher padisa. Atone for the children of Israel whom you have redeemed. Kaper la'am Klal Yisrael asher padisa. What does that mean? Asher padisa Hashem, that you have redeemed God. Ru'uya kapara zu shetechaper al yotzei Mitzrayim. And that means, what does it mean to atone for the children, the people of Israel, that you have redeemed in the past? That this atonement should atone for those who left Egypt. So, because it says you have redeemed. So we see from here that the eglah rufa is an atonement also for those who left Egypt. So it atones for even for the owners who have died. The Gemara says, "Midame." The case is again is a huge distinction. Kulu istun migo demekapra achayim. Awesome, cool. Eastern there, it includes both the living and the dead, since it atones for the living, since it atones for the people at that time, because there's a dead body found in their midst, it also atones for those who are dead. But in this case, in the case of Babylon, where they returned after 70 years, would there still be people alive who are there 70 years later? That this offering that they brought, these 12 sin offerings, are atoning for them? And Gemara says, yes, in Achinami Dachsiv, the Rabbim Kohanim V'Alavim V'Rashei Avos, because it says in the pasuk that there were many of the Kohanim Alavim and the heads of the tribes who saw the first temple, and they came back and they were crying when they saw the second temple being built, because they knew that it was just an approximation, a shadow of the first temple, and so they were crying. So we see that there was people who saw it, the first one, maybe they were 10 years old, and it's only 70 years later, so they're 80 years old now, and now they understood that it was something to cry about, that it was not the same. Mura says, but still, it shouldn't be okay. Maybe it was just the minority. Even though there are many Kohanim Elavim, maybe it was just the minority of the community, and so therefore, it will be like a sin offering whom most of its owners have died, which cannot be brought. And here we saw that it was brought. So the Gemara's answer is, don't say that. The Gemara says, "Aksiv truas hasimcha lo ikiru b'kol truas hasimcha b'chiya'am v'kol nishma ad l'merachok." It says that the people were crying. They couldn't hear the laughing because more people were crying, because it was the majority of the people there were ones who had survived from the first temple. And so we see from here that they were all there in the majority were there in the first temple, and that's why they brought this sin offering. The Gemara says, you had a question, Bill? Yeah, it's which one? Yeah. It's a quote from the book of Ezra, chapter 3. You're not to tell if it's a quote from a verse. It's if it's in the English, it's usually in the italics, and they usually have a footnote citing it. So the Gemara says, but why were they bringing the sin offering? A sin offering is brought for an accidental offering. In the generation of Tzidkiyahu, they were intentional sinners, and they were worthy to be killed and not an offering. So how could they achieve an atonement with this sin offering? Mara says, even though they were purposeful, they were able to achieve atonement. It was a one-time ruling. And Hachinami excuse me. The Hachinami Mistab, it's logical to say this. If you don't want to say it was an extenuating case, because it says, Elam Tishem Vishisha, Kvasim Shivim Vishiva. There were 96 rams and 77 sheep keneged me. What was that relation to? It was one time. So if one person from the community died, they still bring the communal offering. But what about Echami based in? But if one person from the court dies, then we're going to say Peturin. Then there is an exemption from bringing the bull offering. Montana, who's the source of this? Amar Rabbi Chisda, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rav, Rabbi Meir. This must be the position of Rabbi Meir. The Amar Bezim Evim Tzibur. Because remember, Rabbi Meir says that the court brings it and not the community. Hilkach Meis Echad Menat Tzibur Chayavin. The Kam Kue. Therefore, if one in the community dies, they still have to bring it because everybody's still there. The entire Bezdin is still there. But Bezdin Meis Echad. Dakam koi bezdin, but meis echad mi bezdin p'turin that way chata shemeis echad minach shutfin. And if one member of the court dies, then we're going to say that they don't bring it anymore because it's like a sin offering where one of the partners has died. Now, technically speaking, partners don't bring a sin offering, but they introduce this new language in this case to talk about this unique scenario. Amoy Abaye. Oh, it's Shemachi Peturin. And that's why they're exempt. So Maska for Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says, why do you have to assume that this price is like Rabbi Meir, like Rabbi Shimon, that are Bezdin Imat Tzibur? Why don't we say it's like it could be like Rabbi Shimon who says the Bezdin brings it with the community? Meisechad Menat Tzibur. If one from the community dies, Chayavin, then we're going to say they still have to bring it. The Ein Tzibur Meisim. Because like Rav Papa taught, the community does not die, but Meisachami Bezdin Peturin. But if one from the court dies, then they still have to bring it. It's a sin offering of partners. So Amar Abaye, no. It wouldn't be like Rabbi Shimon, because Shamina Rabbi Shimon, the Amar Chata Shutfin Ena Misa. We know that Rabbi Shimon's in the position that the sin offering of partners is not going to be considered like they died, and they still bring it even though one of the Bezdin died. The Tanya Parvasayer Shal Yom Kippur. Let's say you have a bull and a goat of Yom Kippur. Sha'avdu, and you lost it. You somehow lost the bull and the goat. So you somehow lost the bull and the goat. You separated a new bull and new goat. And then after you did that, you brought the atonement, and then you found the first ones. Yamusakun. Then both the bull and the goat they die. They are not offered. Divi Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yeru, Aflish Ein Chatas Tzibur Mesa. He says they do not have to die, but they just let them graze because we don't say this principle of communal offerings have died. And so therefore, in the case here too, we would say that this could be the position of Rabbi Shimon, that if even though one of the court has died, we still could bring that offering. You had a question, Bill? I'm like Rav Yosef Kohanim Kamas. You're asking me a kasha from the Kohanim on Yom Kippur? Kohanim Kamas? From the law of the animal, the bull and the goat on Yom Kippur? Shani Kohanim Dikru Kal. No, Kohanim are different. They're considered a kal. Dichsiv al Kohanim al kol kal amakal yikaper. That the Kohanim are compared to a kal. And so therefore, they're like the law of a community and not like the law of Shutfim. And so therefore, the Kohanim, therefore the animals do not have to die. The Gemara says, if that's the case, if Rav Yosef is saying the Kohanim are called a Kahal, if that's the case, Naisu Par Ra, the Kohanim should bring the bull on their own. Meaning to say, let's say the court ruled and the majority of the community did it on their basis, and also the Kohanim. Each tribe has to bring it, and also the Kohanim should have to bring it. If you're saying the Kohanim are their own law, they should have to bring, they're called the Kahal, and therefore they should have to bring a tribe. They should have to bring an offering, and so then we would have 13 animals, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that are brought, and according to Rabbi Shimon, not 12. Rabbi Shimon would say 14. If that would be the case, Tafilu shvatim, chitim achinami, tafilu shvatim, we would have one extra one. So, and we don't. Elam malach bar Rabbi Yaakov, shifto shel Levi lo ikru kahal. The tribe of Levi is not called a kahal. And as a result of that, also the Kohanim are not called a kahal, because they're in the tribe of Levi. And since the Paraham ever is only on someone who's called a kahal, therefore the Leviim or the Kohanim do not bring a bull at all. And how do we know that tribe of Levi is called a kahal? How do we know that the tribe of Levi is not called a kahal? We had this at the end of yesterday's daf, that Jacob says that he was told that he would be blessed to have a kahal, and so but it's connected to the land of Israel. Anyone that has an inheritance in the land of Israel, ikri kahal, is called a kahal. Anyone who does not have inheritance in the land is not called a kahal. If that's the case, if the Levi is not called a kahal, then we don't have the 12 tribes. So if that's the case, Amar Bai, no. Bai says Ephraim, Menashe, Reuven, Shimon, and Yehuda. Ephraim and Menashe are called the kahal, and meaning say Yosef is divided into two, and so therefore that's how we get to 12. So Amar Rabba Vaksiv al Shem Nachayemi Karuben Nachosam, which means Nachla Hukshuv Lo Davar Acher. No, they're only called they only are going to be called that with respect to an inheritance in the land, but not with respect to something else. And so if that's the case, they wouldn't bring a bull as a result of it. So therefore, we were back to 11. Mara says, you mean it's just for inheritance that they're called a tribe? What about with respect to the Degel? Each tribe has their own Degel, and they have their own tribe Degel. So the Gemara says, no, that's not an answer. Well, just like they have an inheritance, so too they have a Degel. Gemara says, no, but just to give honor to them, honor us, it would be lopsided. You would have 3, 3, 3, and 2. It wouldn't be a fair camp. Gemara says, but Ephraim and Menashe also have their own princes. And that was just to give out an extra kibbud. The Tanya Shlomo Shlomo did 7 days of dedication of the temple. Mara Moshe Why did Moshe have to do 12 days of dedication? Just to give honor to the princes. And if that's the case, that's not because Ephraim and Menashe are considered two tribes, but only to give honor to the princes. And so therefore, they're only considered one tribe, not two. And so therefore, they only bring one bull. If that's the case, Sheva Levi brings the bull, and the Kohanim do not bring the bull. And so from the fact that the Chatas of the Kohanim does not die, it proves that Chatas HaShutfim does not die, according to Rabbi Shimon. So now the Gemara says, remember we saw a dispute back on Amud Aleph that according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon says, Chatas Shutfim, if you have partners like in a Bezdin and one of the people in the Bezdin dies, that according to Rabbi Yosef, the animal has to die. And Abaye rejects that and he says, according to Rabbi Shimon, no, the animal doesn't have to die. This law doesn't apply by partners. How do we rule about it? How do we rule like Rabbi Yosef? The animal would have to die there, or like Abaye that it doesn't. So how do we decide about this? There are 5 sin offerings that these sin offerings die, and they're not brought as an offering, and we don't allow them to graze. We just stick them in a room, lock the door until they die. For these 5 sin offerings, they are vlad chatas, the offspring of a sin offering. Temuras chatas, if you did a temur, you exchange a sin offering. The chatas shemesu ba'aleha. So basically, an offspring of a chatas who you exchanged it, chatas whose owner died, chatas sheniskaber ba'aleha, a chatas whose owner brought a different carbon and was already atoned. And number 5, a chatas she'avar shnasa. A chatas only within the first year, and now it's after 1 year, so it can no longer be brought. So ve'iyat yachol amar v'ad chatas b'tzibor, and you can't have a offspring of a chatas by a communal offering. Shein tzibor mafrish in a keva, because the community brings a male, not a female. You also can't have a temuras chatas by community, because the community cannot do a temura. We're going to get to tractate temura. Temura is only something that can happen by an individual, not by a community. You're not allowed to do temura, but if you do temura, it takes effect. You're not allowed to exchange an animal, but if people do all sorts of things that they're not supposed to do. Somebody says, I'm changing, I want to switch out this cow for this bull for that bull. Whatever he wants to do, it's not allowed, and it's a terrible punishment, but it takes effect. And so now the sin offering cannot be brought. We're going to get to that when we get to Tractate Temura. So the Gemara says, and you can't say this case of chatas whose owner has died by a community, because the community does not die. But what about the other two? Chatas that the owner already achieved atonement, or that it was more than a year old. We don't know the law. Yachal Yamu. So I might think that these animals do die. Amras Yomot Sasam and Amafresh. So we say in the Brisa, you learn out the cases which we don't know from the cases that are explicit. And what do we have? The cases explicit. Just like we say by the case of an offspring of chatas does not apply to the community, because the community brings a male animal. And also Temuras chatas doesn't apply, because that doesn't apply by a community. And also the owner has died. It doesn't apply because ein tzibor, ein mesa mitzibor. Just like those don't apply. Sheyachid, shebiyachid var mamurim v'lo b'tzibor. All those cases only apply to an individual, not to the community. Afshin eschaper ba'alav v'sha'avar shnasa b'yachid var mamurim v'lo b'tzibor. So too, these other cases don't apply to a communal sin offering. And so therefore we see, according to Rabbi Shimon, also there's no chatas tzibor mesa. And so that's exactly the case of Abaye. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? We don't accept this limud of the Brisa. The chidan efshar mishe'i efshar. You can't learn out a case from it's impossible to the case that's possible. The first 2 cases is something that's impossible. The last 2 cases are possible. So it's not necessarily the case. Rabbi Shimon won't say that. And so Rabbi Shimon b'cha makom gamir. And so therefore, Rabbi Shimon only learns it in the first case and not in the last case. Hadron alach or Bezdin. Return to this very, very beautiful chapter of Horayos called Horu Bezdin. We really need to take a lot of time to think about the implications of this price, of this chapter. But we'll stop here. If anybody's any questions, I'm happy to address it. Yeah, question, Bill? Bill? Oh, okay.